Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Say. Okay, so last week we discussed the controversy and one man's crusade to change the nusach from Mashav Ruach HaMerit HaGashem back to what he sees as the original nusach of Mashav Ruach HaMerit HaGashem. And we discussed how a lot of the Siddurim eventually were molded to that preference. We spoke about the various Gedalim on both sides. And to some extent, we opened up Pandora's box on the exact way that Nusach and Nusach HaTfilah and Siddurim are shaped throughout the Deiris. So I do want to spend, I guess, the next few weeks discussing various interesting Nekudas and elements and points of this Nusach discussion. I want to start with this. There's a interesting sefer called Memori Tuvia. It's all the articles that Tuvia Prashel wrote over the years. I think now his daughter put them together and Mossad Rav Kook is publishing them. It's a very eclectic collection of articles, on all sorts of different topics. Now, there's an article over here that he wrote in 1963 that discusses an interesting phenomenon that kind of opens up the discussion of Nusach HaSiddur. It's as follows. The article is titled HaSiddur HaChadash Shel Tzahal, the new Siddur of the army. I'll read you the first few lines, then we'll explain what it says. He says, Harav Rashi Shel Tzahal, the chief rabbi of the IDF, Rabbi Reb Shlomo Goren, Hoyel Betuve Litan Li Le'iyun Es HaTayfas Harishan Shel Siddur Tzahal. He was nice and kind to me. He gave me the first edition of the Siddur Tzahal. Sha'ata Zeh Yoytze La'ar V'nishnach L'Rav Goren Hashva Ata B'New York. And they sent him a few copies, and he sent me one of them. And he reads, and he starts describing a little bit what's so unique about the Siddur. He says, for example, in the kuntras of Dinei Tfilah L'Chayal, that's printed in the Siddur over there, in the Hilchas Hashkama, it says as follows, Shivisi Hashem L'Negdi Samid U'Klal Gada B'Teira, that says that in every Siddur, Kavanas HaDvarim, She'ir Ha'adam Esatzmei Tamid, Ka'imid L'Fnei HaMelech Malchei HaMlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Then it continues, and it says as follows, Al Chayalei Yisrael B'Machane, soldiers of the IDF who are in camp, Yeshno Tzav Miyuchad Lishmar Al Kedushas HaChayim V'Teira Amidus. They have a special tzivoy to be shomer and kedushas HaChayim and Teira Amidus Kiksiv Ki Hashem Alikecha Mesalach B'Kerem Machanecha L'Atzilcha V'Las Sevecha L'Fanecha V'Hoyim Machanecha Kadesh V'Yir B'Chayer V'Zdav V'Shav Mecharecha. For example, so he shows like a highlight of in the halacha, the Nispach Hilchati that's in the Siddur Tzahal, it includes this din of for Chayalim. Then another one it says about Chayalim who live in large camps. I'll read you. It says Chayalei Yisrael Yishenim Yachad Ba'oil. And a soldier was sleeping in a barracks or in a large group together. One of them wants to get up earlier, to get up very quietly, to not wake up his tired comrades who are tired from their missions. And he brings, a whole handful of examples of this, of these interesting halachas, pseudo-halachic annotations that are placed in the Siddur. But he says the interesting part of the Siddur is not all that. He says, Yichudei shel Siddur zeh, lo b'kuntras dinei tefillah l'chayel. The interesting part of the Siddur, what makes it unique, is not in the dinei halachas that are enumerated there for chayalim, ela b'shtei milis snuas hanitfasis b'sharoi. There's two humble words on the sharblat that explain what is unique about the Siddur. Leinemer sham nusach svarad, v'lei nusach ashkenaz. It doesn't say nusach svarad, it doesn't say nusach ashkenaz. Ela nusach achid. The nusach of unity, the unity nusach, the Unitarian nusach, call it. Unitarian is actually the wrong word, but the nusach of unity is what it says in the front of the Siddur. And then he explains how the army of Eretz Yisrael, the Tzahal, is a tremendous melting pot of all the various different types of Jews that are living in Eretz Yisrael at the time. And therefore, it's where often, nusach clashes as to what nusach should they be davening and who should daven what comes up. And in order to avoid machlekes and pilug amongst the soldiers, he has this idea to create a nusach achid, a nusach that will take from what he considers, what Rabbi Goren considered to be the meitav hanuschayis of all the various different nuschayis that exist, primarily focused on nusach svarad. He felt that was the best pshara that existed, and Hashem will get up to what nusach svarad is and why it is a good pshara, isn't a good pshara, and he created a nusach achid. Now, suffice to say that Rav Goren's hamsa to create a nusach achid, although in the scheme of things was from the less controversial innovations in Psakim that Rav Goren tried to introduce, but it was not something that was widely received, and short of the fact that it was used in some like pre-military preparatory high schools which I think still exists or whatever, or stuff like that, it wasn't really widely adopted. And, this wasn't something that made a big impact. Now, what's interesting is Rabbi Preschel, when he writes this little review of the Siddur, admittedly, he seems to be happy with it. He does not write as to what would be the halachic underpinning. What's the halachic rationale or ability to create such a shina in neschayis? Meaning, when is it okay to change neschayis? When is it not okay to change neschayis? He does not go into that in any detail. But in some other chuvas, in a kavitz, I think it's in one of the Hamayans, or it's in Hareshes, I don't remember which one I saw it in. There are different articles written by Charedi Leumi Rabbanim, who are, so to speak, defending this creation, this tefillah creation that Rav Goren was innovating on, and explaining where it comes from. And interestingly, the primary sources that they use to source that there should be the idea of a nusach achid, a nusach that works for everybody, harkens back to the original battle that the Chassidim had when they changed the nusach from nusach Ashkenaz to nusach Sfarad. So the Chassidim, in their tshuvas, written primarily by the Divrei Chaim and the Minchas Elazar, and the Kamarna Rebbes and others who wrote, in defense of nusach Hari or nusach Sfarad or various different shina neschayis that the Chassidim sought to implement, in their defenses of that, they wrote with such language of a nusach that's suitable for the rank and file, a nusach that's suitable for everybody. They discussed things in that terminology, and these Rabbanim who sought to support Rav Goren's innovation, so to speak, piggybacked on the older Chassidic literature, Chassidic halachic literature, to justify nusach Sfarad, which is just an interesting display in worlds colliding. And I won't go into detail as to what that is now, because over time we'll get to the details of those machleksin. But I just thought this is an interesting opener, an element to show this. So now, let's go through some gross oversimplification of the neschayis as they exist, so to speak, today. Now, today in the world, one could say the primary neschayis that exist in the world are, let's call it, let's say 5 or 6 neschayis that are the primary, most common neschayis. Let's say nusach Ashkenaz, Edot HaMizrach, which is, let's call Svardim, nusach Svard, nusach Teiman, which has its own, nusach Reimi, which is the Italian nusach, which has its own, and then I'm missing. I guess, and you could say nusach Hari, which is again similar to nusach Svard in some regards, but not exactly. It's unclear what exactly it is. Let's say there are 5 or 6 primary nuschayis that exist in the world today. Now, the truth is that if we wind back the clock, there was really only 2. Originally, there was a nusach Bavel and a nusach Eretz Yisrael. Those are the 2 nuschayis that Klal Yisrael davened from. In Chazal, there is no authoritative and conclusive nusach that everyone's supposed to daven with. There's snippets throughout the Gemara, Sayim, Bavli, Sayim, Yerushalmi, that describe nuschayis of specific tefillas, specific structures, what we're looking to have. But overall, the nusach hatfila, as organized by the Anshe Knesset Agdela and Shimon Apakuli and the various different ones, there is no one conclusive siddur that was published from Yimei Chazal. So to the point that by the time the Gaonim came around, there was already limited, but some literature of various Gaonim, like Rav Nutronoi Gaon, who published a tshuva describing the Mei Brachas, and in there he gives some nusach hatfila, and Rav Amram Gaon, who published what I guess we would call the first authoritative siddur, which is nusach hatfila, and then later on the Rambam in his Yad put one, to the point where probably, and I saw a graph in a sefer somewhere, there was at the time of the end of the Tkufas HaGaonim, and when it's starting the Tkufas HaRishonim, one could say there was probably, I'll count them out for you, it's an incredible amount. There was a nusach Ashkenaz, a nusach Provence, which is the south of France, a nusach Svard HaKadum, which is not exactly like the Svard that we have today, which is more of an amalgamation, a nusach Italia, a nusach Romania, which means probably the Greek, like Greek and the islands, that's nusach Romania, a nusach of North Africa, a nusach of Morocco, a nusach of Iranian nusach, a nusach of Mitzrayim, but not Mitzrayim, not Sephardic Mitzrayim, but like pre-Sephardic Mitzrayim, call it Mitzrayim Mistarvim, like the Jews who lived in Islamic countries 1,000 years ago. There's a nusach Teiman, which is not exactly like the nusach Teiman today, which is much more molded by the Rambam, but there is a nusach Teiman. There's a nusach of Syria, which is nusach Aram Tzova, and Damasek, or they're similar to each other. Again, later, let's call it more things melded more better together into just the Edut HaMizrach Nusach. Then there's, from the Goinim, there's the Rasag, there's Rav Amram Goin, there's the Rambam's Nusach. So I don't even know how many that is, but it's probably somewhere between 10 and 15 various Nuschayos that exist, at the turn of the last millennia, at the end of the Goinim Stufa, heading into the Rishonim Stufa. Now, over time, most of these little, regional Nuschayos kind of melded into the primary Nuschayos, so that, 500 years ago, there was primarily the Nuschayos that we described, that we opened with, the 5-6 Nuschayos that we described, and from amongst those, pride of place, we would say, was given to Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfaradim, not what we call Nusach Sfarad today, but Nusach Sfaradim, what we could call the Nusach of the Edot HaMizrach. Now, those are the two primary Nuschayos, those are the two most ancient Nuschayos of most originalist ancient Nuschayos, although they also were impacted by these various Nuschayos that we're talking about, but those are the two originalist Nuschayos. Now, obviously, a debate rages which one of those two is the better Nusach, and the truth is that each one of them has Givus Amilus over each other, and that's not really what I want to go into today, cross-comparing Nusach Ashkenaz and Sfarad. Let's just say that the Sfaradic Nusach and the Ashkenaz Nusach are both well-established and well-anchored Nuschayos by the time, the Shulchan Aruch is being written, by the time the Gedolei Achronim are on the scene. Those are well-established and acceptable Nuschayos, and anyone who's in either camp of those is in good company and has no problem to daven the way he davens. Now, the Sfaradic Nusach, which is, I think, to my mind, primarily based on Rav Amram Goin's Nusach, it had like a period of, so to speak, conquest, when it began to dominate all the other sub-Sfaradim Nuschayos, and they became some sort of organization into a more unified Nusach, and that was in the shadow of the Spanish Inquisition. In the end of the 1400s, throughout the whole 1400s, as the Spanish Jewish Kehillah, which had just gone through a tremendous golden era, right? It was the crown jewel of Yiddishkeit. It was undisturbed. They were wealthy. They were intelligent. They were Talmidei Chachamim. It was literally the crown jewel of Yiddishkeit. Like Rav Adi was always prevalent to say recently, Lachzar Torah Liyoshna, to return the crown where it belongs, meaning it was the crown jewel of Yiddishkeit at the time. Many of the Gedolei Rishonim whose Torah we still shape everything with today are from the Sfarad of those days. Sai in the field of Paitanim, Sai in the field of Limud HaTorah, Sai in the field of Diktuk, in every type of field. And they had a well-established and well-organized Nusach that was passed down for hundreds of years in Sfarad. Now, over the 1300s and into the through the late 1300s, starting in 1390s, all the way through 1492, the reconquest of Spain from the Islamic countries was begun by the Christian armies in the north. And over time, as the Christian armies in northern Spain completed their route and their march through all of Spain and unified the Iberian Peninsula, under the cross, the situation for the Jews there became increasingly difficult and increasingly hard, and culminating in the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel, who, with the famous Edict of Expulsion, kicked all the Jews out. Now, we know, unfortunately, that a significant number of the Jews, or a substantial number of the Jews, were not able to be Nisayan one way or the other. Either they stayed and became Marranos, and then over the Dairis melted into the melting pot of Christian Europe, or directly converted at the time. But there was a significant amount, maybe 200,000 or something in that range, of Spanish Jews who were put on boats from the ports in Spain and dispersed all throughout the Jewish world. Now, they ended up in many, so to speak, Ashkenazi countries as well. They founded great societies in what today are known as Ashkenazi countries, like England, like Germany. Even parts of Hungary had a large Sephardic population. But they primarily dispersed themselves into the Turkish Empire, who was more welcoming to them. And they entered Turkey and Greece, and to some degree Eretz Yisrael, Tzfas, Tveria, northern Eretz Yisrael, Mitzrayim, North Africa, Tunisia, Algeria, and they dispersed into all these different locales. And over time, they took over the Nuschayos, to the point where there was a major consolidation, where the Nuschayos in most of these places that had their own version of ancient Nuschayos became the Nusach Sfarad that we know from Spain. And this had even the imprimatur of the Gedolei HaPaiskim D'Rabbanan. There's a famous tshuva from the Rashdam in Arich Chaim and Simon Lamed Hey, where he writes about a Kehillah in Turkey. he was Turkish, and he writes about a kehillah in Turkey that inquired with him about the melding of the kehillas, and they want to know which nusach to go with. And he says, although there's great beauty in maintaining your own traditions and your own minhagim, and Kayidua, the Yerushalmi says, Hizar b'minig avisechem, and we don't change and we keep our old traditions, but the tradition of the tefillah of Nusach Sfarad, the Sfaradim that's being brought to us now from Aragon and Catalonia and Castile, where the ancient Spanish communities lived throughout the Golden Era, is a beautiful and well-sourced and well-established Nusach, and therefore you should bend to it and it should become the primary Nusach. And over a short amount of time, the primary Nusach throughout all Sephardic lands became the Nusach Eidot Mizrach, and that was the completion of the consolidation. So to the point where in the early 1500s, let's say the mid 1500s, or even let's call it let's say 1550, when the Shulchan Aruch is being written and the Ramah is active and the Marshal is active and the Arizal is active and all these various leading lights of the mid 1500s are active, the Nuschayis that Klal Yisrael is primarily davening from is Nusach Sfarad and Nusach Ashkenaz. Those are the two Nuschayis, and by this I don't mean Nusach Ashkenaz, Nusach Sfarad with the Chassidim, I mean Nusach Sfaradim. Just reiterating that again. Now, so these are the two primary Nuschayis, and in the Paiskim of those days and in the Paiskim of today, you'll find, and if you look in the beginning of Siman Samaches, there's Magen Avram and Chuvas from the Aries Paiskim, later Paiskim, Reb Moshe and Reb Tzvi Pesach and Reb Uziah from the chief rabbi and Reb Vadia, and obviously earlier Paiskim like the Chassam Sofer and others, strongly encourage people to stick to their nusach. Each nusach is verified, each nusach is capable, each nusach is presumed to have in it the depth and richness of the tefillas from the Anshe Knesset Agdel and tefillas from earlier Deiris, and each cries in Klal Yisrael is encouraged to maintain its nuschayis. So now, I want to talk about where that begins to change, and I think, and I could be wrong, but I think that if we have to point the finger at what era in history it becomes, so to speak, acceptable, or there seems to be a pivot towards the change of nuschayis and making amalgamations and consolidations of different various streams of tefillah to create new nuschayis, seems to be in the times of the Arizal. So to open this up, and I apologize for all the hakdamis, but I just want to discuss this in its proper way. We need to give a hakdama into who the Arizal was, to the best of our ability, and what his contribution in particular to the field of tefillah, in general to the field of Jewish minhagim, where he excises a tremendous outsized influence. There's so many minhagim that made it into the daily retinue of a Jew and made it into the halacha that the source could be pointed to the Arizal V'Gurav, the Arizal Talmidim. But in particular, I want to talk about the Arizal, the person, the Arizal, the Arizal's contribution, his samchus, how he was widely accepted, and from there we'll move on to his particular contribution to Nusach HaTefillah. So now, obviously, there is no what we would call like an authoritative biographical sketch of the Arizal. Most of the Arizal's biography is somewhat murky and somewhat neatened to various opinions. So I'll give a form of a consensus opinion on the Arizal's history, and then we'll move on to to the Arizal, who he was and his provenance and his origin, and Mamela, his contribution to the various minhagim and etc. So the Arizal, as far as we could tell, was born in 1534 in Yerushalayim. To who exactly his family was is a point of great contention, so I'm going to leave that tab open and we'll come back to that. That's relevant to his contribution to Tefillah. But Arizal was born to a father. His father's name was, I believe, Reb Shlomo. Arizal's Reb Yitzchak ben Reb Shlomo Ashkenazi. So his father, Reb Shlomo, was considered an Adam Gadol, someone who later Kabbalistic Svarim referred to as having Ruach HaKodesh. And it's even brought down, I think, in the Sefer Mikdash Ma'at, I forgot who the Mechaber is the second, who writes that Arizal's father had Gili Elio, and in Elio, and if he told him to prepare himself, he's going to have a very special child who's going to be this Arizal, and the details of Elio Hanavi coming to his bris, and etc. So Arizal had a very providential birth to his father in Yerushalayim. Now, by 5 years old, Arizal's father is Nifter, and Arizal becomes a young Yassim living in Yerushalayim. His mother attempts to make a parnasa, or to live from what's available, but isn't able to. And shortly later, when Arizal's 8 years old, she makes a trip, and they move to Cairo, Egypt, I believe, to where she was from, where her family was from. Interestingly, is that her last name, which we don't know from her, but her brother, seems to be Francis, which is a name whose origin and etymology is not so clear. It's possibly a Spanish name, but it's possibly not a Spanish name, so it's even not so clear. The common wisdom is that his mother was from a Sephardic family, and the whole Kehillah in Cairo at the time was Sephardim, and her brother lived there, and etc. But the name Francis is something that gives pause, and it might not be a Sephardic family. It could be it is, could be it isn't. There's some scholarly debate on that matter. In any case, the Arizal moves back to Egypt, where he lives with his family, and he learns with his tutor. And at a young age, he already surpasses the wisdom of everyone that's available there. And eventually he goes to learn in what we could call a Talmud Chaver relationship with Rebbe Tzalel Ashkenazi, the Baal Shita Mekubetzes, another famous Talmud Chacham of the era, who also ultimately migrates to Tzfas, I believe. And they're learning together under the tutelage of the Radvaz. And although this is not super clear how we know that they learned together by the Radvaz, it's not 1,000,000% clear, but he learns, in a Talmud Chaver relationship with Rebbe Tzalel Ashkenazi under the general auspices, the general tutelage of the Radvaz. Now, they learn for many, many years together, and there's a specific count of days that Chaim Vital says over, count of years, and what the Arizal learned what, to the point where the Arizal learned for a solid 10 years alone, some years, 7 years with the Chavrusa, 10 years alone, and you put it all together, he's about 36 years old, fully educated, surpassed and superseded everybody around him, and is living in Mitzrayim, learning on his own. Now, at this point, the Arizal has Gilui Elio, he has tremendous Gilui Elio all along, and if you look at the Shivchei Arizal, Sai the Rav Chaim Vital version and Sai the other versions, in particular Rabbi Yaakov Hillel's version of Shivchei Ari, they combine them with many, many other Isafis. You see the various Giluyim and etc. And I'm not going to go into that. And Rav Chaim Vital later, in his many Svarim, in his many in the Sha'arim and in the Pri Etz Chaim, he says over different occurrences that the Arizal said over about himself with Gilui Elio and etc. So it's not for today's discussion, but the Arizal has Gilui Elio. Elionavi tells him that you're not going to live very long, and it's time to go to Tzfas, to Eretz Yisrael, to be Megali yourself and to give over your Torah. There's someone there who's going to be ready for your Gilui. Now, Tzfas at the time is in its golden age. Tzfas is populated with Talmidei Chacham of note, like a host of Talmidei Chacham of note. For example, the Beis Yosef, the Mabit, the Marit, the Ramak, Rav Shlomo Elkabetz, the Radvaz, the Shita Mekubetzes, the Marival, the Alshich, the Rav Shmuel de Yuzida, the Mechaber, the Medrash Shmuel, Uchehena v'chehena rabbis, many superstar, outstanding Talmidei Chacham who are populating Tzfas's ranks at the time. And the Arizal is instructed to go to Tzfas to begin to give over his Torah, his Giluyim, his light. Now, what's interesting is that the Arizal, it seems, made an attempt to go to Yerushalayim, but was unsuccessful, which is the Mukubalim point out, and again, I can't speak to this, but there's a rationale to this. The Mukubalim point out that there's these types of Giluyim that, let's say, the Arizal, the Baal Shem Tov, or Nachman, or other Mukubalim were seeking to make in Eretz Yisrael, was not suitable for Eretz Yisrael, for Yerushalayim at the time. And Memela, they were, guided by the Yad Hashem to end up in Tzfas. Even, and then there's many examples. That's not for today's discussion. In any case, the Arizal arrives in Tzfas, and he begins to give over his Giluyim. There he finds a Talmud, a primary Talmud, a Talmud worthy of him sharing his Giluyim with, and who's going to become the Arizal's primary Talmud. What's amazing is that all the Giluyim that Rav Chaim Vital, who becomes the Arizal's primary gatekeeper and disseminator of the Arizal's Torah, all of this Torah is in 2 years. The Arizal dies at 38 during a terrible plague in Tzfas at the time. He dies in 1572, I believe, and it's all in 2 years. It's an amazing, brilliant shooting star that shows itself on the scene in Tzfas at the time. Now, to mark, just as a raya, as a symbol of the Arizal's tremendous establishment on the scene and what it was seen as, is I saw brought down from I forgot now which sefer it comes from, but the Sfaradim have a piyut that they say, a kinna that they say on Tisha B'Av, that the kinna is called, the name of the kinna is called Lemievka, and in here there's a line that says you say that hayesh say this hatayra hayesh maitzi la'ira. And meaning we're bemoaning the fact that the Seydis HaTorah don't have someone to bring them to light, and they're not becoming known to everybody. And during the time of the Arizal, it's gebracht in Svarim, different Svarim from Talmidim and Chaim Vital. During the Tkufa where the Arizal is living in Sfas, the Kehila, the Sephardic Kehila, ceased to say this kinna for the 2 or 1.5 Tisha, or maybe I have to do the math of the exact months that he came there, but let's say the 2 or 3 Tisha B'avs that the Arizal lived in Sfas. They felt it was inappropriate to bemoan the fact that there's no one to give over Seder Satira when there's currently a overflow, a fountain, a Niagara Falls of Gilei Sister Atira being given over in Sfas at the time. Now, of course, no good thing goes without any controversy. And there's a legendary story that's said over, and I'll say one of the versions. There's more than one version. The Chidah and Shem Gedolim, when he brings about the Arizal, he brings that there's some sort of story of 3 shared Talmidim of the Radvaz, and the controversy of when the Arizal, started saying over his Giluyim. Now, in Reb Meir Mazuz's Migdali Yisrael, in Chelik Aleph, in his piece on the Arizal, which is actually relatively short, he brings a very lengthy arichos of a story of the Arizal and 2 other Rabbeinu Yitzchaks who learned together with him by the Radvaz, and one who excelled in Lumdis and one who excelled in something else, and the Arizal. But that's not the version that I want to say over. I think I've said this over in the past once, but I want to say over the version that I believe the Torah Tamim, or the Makar Baruch, brings B'Shem Rav Chaim Volozhiner, and that goes as follows. That when the Arizal arrived in Tzfas, he was preceded by the Shita Mekubetzes and the Radvaz, who were his Rebbe Chaver and his Rebbe Plain. And when the Arizal began to say, lectures of Shiurim in Kabbalah, there was pushback, and the Radvaz, who had been his Rebbe in Egypt, felt that it was inappropriate. He was a young man, he was 36 years old. He felt it was inappropriate, and he asked Rebbe Tzal Ashkenazi, the Shita Mekubetzes, do me a favor. I want you to go to the next shir, the next lecture that the Arizal gives on Kabbalah, and hack in and make ruckus and disturb the shir, so that this doesn't become, de rigueur. It doesn't become something that the Arizal gets comfortable doing. And the B'tzal Ashkenazi is not happy with his misima, with his mission, but his Rebbe asked him to do it, and he commits to going to do it. The Arizal, there's an announcement, the Arizal is going to give a shir b'inyan, Kabbalah, and B'tzal Ashkenazi makes his way over there, and he sits himself down in one of the front pews, and he's waiting till the shir develops, till they get to the meat of the shir, and he's going to plan on hacking in. Right before, moments before B'tzal Ashkenazi is ready to hack in, he sees from the back door the Radvaz walks in. The Radvaz himself, the Radvaz had tremendous arichas yamim. He was an old, zaken, v'ragel b'yeshiva. He walks in and he sits down near B'tzal Ashkenazi. Now B'tzal Ashkenazi sits mum. He's not going to hack into the shir. If the Radvaz came himself, if he thinks it's worthy of hacking in, let him hack in. If he doesn't, he won't. He's in the presence of his Rebbe now. He's not going to do anything. And the Radvaz sits quietly. Okay, they leave the shir and everything goes b'shalom b'sheket. The next day, the Radvaz meets B'tzal Ashkenazi again. He asks B'tzal Ashkenazi, did you do what I was mitzvah you? Did you do what I asked you to do to the Arizal shir? And B'tzal Ashkenazi gives him this dumbfounded look. He says, what do you mean? You Rebbe, you came yourself. You were sitting there with me. I wasn't going to do it in your presence. And the Radvaz says, me? I didn't come. I was sitting here the whole time. And they all understood that obviously Eliyahu Hanavi came looking in the tzura of the Radvaz to protect the Arizal's shir and to protect the geyser of Seder Satira that the Arizal was imparting to the Tkufa, to the Dar, to the Talmidim there, and to not have it disturbed. And Rav Chaim Volozhiner was known to have said, when he would say over the story, he would say, Ashreinu, Ashreinu, Ashreinu. Ashreinu that we had an Arizal who had these type of Giluyim and had this secret knowledge, this wellspring of knowledge about Seder Satira to give over and to transform Klal Yisrael with. Ashreinu that we had a Radvaz who was roy that Eliyahu Hanavi would take on his form. Eliyahu Hanavi wouldn't just take on anybody's form; he took on the Radvaz's form. And Ashreinu that we had a Rebbe Tzal Ashkenazi, the Shita Mekubetzes, who was roy to see Eliyahu Hanavi and to participate in this great mura. Now, in any case, one way or another, there was a tremendous samchus min shemaya that the Arizal's Torah should be given over. And the Arizal, proceeded over the next 2 years to dump voluminous amounts of Seder Satira and Kavanah Satira to his Talmidim, primarily Rav Chaim Vital. The amount that we have written is only a small percentage of the Torah that was. That itself, the transmission and how the Torah of the Arizal was transcribed, into a sefer and when it was published and by who, is itself, worthy of a whole nother share. Not today's discussion. We'll leave that for a different time. In any case, the Arizal's Torah was given over. Now, oh wow! So I see we're going too long over here. We're gonna have to pause at this discussion of the Arizal and the Samchos of the Arizal, which is a tremendous discussion on its own. Meaning the Arizal had the Samchos of his contemporaries. He was like a bright light, a shining star on the scene of Tzvas, which should itself tell us everything that we need to know about the Samchos of the Arizal, because this is a city of legends at the time. But even in the later Paiskim, in the various minusha of daily halacha that the Arizal impacted, there's so many examples that are impacted in regards to shailas, b'chlal, sveikis, and halacha that were were machriya based on the Arizal's understanding of zayars and etc. And there's so much more to talk about this. Maybe I'll close with this, and we'll have to save the Arizal's contribution to Tefillah. I'll close with this interesting display of the Arizal Samchos that and then we'll pause and we'll continue with Nusach Tefillah next week in Mitzvah Hashem. There's something interesting in the Shulchan Atar from the Kamaran Rebbe. It says as follows. It's in Siman Reish Samach. You can look it up. It says as follows: Mitzvah v'chiv midivrei Moran Ari midivrei Azer Hakadosh Litval Benari Mikvah B'chol Erev Shabbos. Now just look at the wording over there. It's a mitzvah v'chiv, a mitzvah from the Divrei Ari. How does the Ari have mitzvahs? Meaning mitzvahs come from the Torah. Mitzvah from the Ari to be tovel benari Mikvah B'chol Erev Shabbos Kodesh. V'chayav Litval Shachar Kodim Atfilah B'Yom Shabbos Al Pi Moran Ari. And you have to go on Shabbos before the Tefillah Al Pi the Moran Ari. Misha over al Dvarav, and here's the punchline. And this is an incredible line to write about something from the Arizal. Misha over al Dvarav B'li Einis. Sharile lemikri avaryana. You could call him an avaryan. He's over. So the way the Kamaran Rebbe is phrasing, and this is let's be honest, it's an extreme proposition. It's not the general consensus of Paiskim that something that Arizal says becomes a mitzvah and Sharile lemikri avaryana if a guy's over in it. Generally, we precede the Arizal's additions as Tesefes Kedusha and etc. But the Kamaran Rebbe is framing it as a mitzvah and Sharile lemikri avaryana. Now, there's a discussion about what could the rationale possibly be for this. Meaning, how could you say something that the Arizal was mitzvah, that the Arizal was mechadish, gets the status of a mitzvah? Now, the Satmar Rebbe famously pointed out that Kveger in Tzagos and Shulchan Aruch and Mekuf Chafei writes about the Arizal they love to shmoyin, which is the pasuk that says to listen to a navi, and perhaps the Rebbe Kveger was, so to speak, suggesting that the Arizal was some sort of me'en nevuah, but of course that's not the pasuk pshat of Rebbe Kveger. Rebbe Kveger was using a witty turn of phrase, which is not uncommon in rabbinic literature by any stretch, and it doesn't mean that he had a din of a navi mamish. Befrat, we know Chazal say several times that the Tkufa of Nubuah was over, and etc. So that's not the pashut pshat, but in any case there are those. I'll give him our makam. I'm not going to go into the pratistic. I really just wanted to use this to highlight the so to speak samchus of the Arizal and how what he says is considered on the highest level of acceptability. You could look. There's a new sefer called Nishmas and Chaditin from it's on Yartzites from Mitchell Meyer Morgenstern, and in there he has a whole pilpul by the Arizal's Yartzeit to explain how the Arizal's words get the take of Sanhedrin based on whatever Ayin Sham, a whole pilpul and whatever. It's a pilpul. It's not pashut pshat by any stretch of the imagination. Obviously, it's out of the mainstream type of proposition. But in any case, I'm just using it to highlight the amazing transformation and acceptability that the Arizal Samchos had. Obviously, regards to halacha l'maaseh k'pshuta, there's the famous Knesset HaGedolah and etc. But that's all to be saved for a later date. Now, what I really wanted to discuss was the Arizal's particular contribution to Nusach HaTefillah, and that again has a lot to do with who the Arizal was. Was he an Ashkenazi? Was he a Sephardi? Which Nusach did he daven? And there's a lot to discuss in that regard. And in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll circle back to that next week. Yeshakayach.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.